Yeah, hello, game data enthusiasts, if I may say so. I am Joe. If you don't know me, I'm an assistant professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and I'm happy to share my work on Guild Wars 2 data analytics and this platform. So that whole platform started as a side project during my PhD time in Bremen in Germany, because I was in need to collect low-level game action data for my work on generative player modeling. But it has become way more than a data collection machine. I refined it over the years and found a series of nice, interesting research questions while doing my postdoc at the UC Santa Cruz. It's called Wingman because we first focused on the end game raid wings of the game. It's still up and running after 2.5 years and more popular than ever before with the player base of Guild Wars 2. And I can also, of course, post the homepage link in the chat later. Yeah, so this project positions itself in a bit of a twilight zone because we have, especially within the scope of this open game data initiative, of course, a lot of cool academic endeavors on how to do game data science, what we can learn for scientific reasons, for educational purposes, psychological, social, whatever. And the game industry, on the other hand, is also quite interested in analytics, but with completely different questions. So how can we extend player retention or inhibit churn or detect bugs and fix them better, or like improve our monetization strategies, that kind of stuff, right? And while the features of this platform here are probably capable of answering some of the academic and some of the industry questions as well, it was designed with a third stakeholder in focus, which is the very player. So there are, of course, a few game analytics platforms that revolve around player interests out there, but even they rarely for a player-driven design cycle, let alone that this development would be scientifically documented or influenced. But still, I hold the opinion that the role of the player is the most important one, of course, when developing games, marketing games, and analyzing games. So before anything else, game design should probably follow player experience, player interests and requirements. So I was, and I'm still convinced that it's a fruitful endeavor to listen to players when it comes to analytics as well, which I will showcase a little bit in this session. So I'll talk about what we've done so far, and then go over to one of the research questions that we have. And I have to shut down my cat, I guess, because she, of course, gets mad in the middle of a talk. That's awesome. Yeah, so in the end, we will come into individual skill acquisition and why this is hard to measure, or like we can brainstorm a little bit about that. So first of all, I think it's good to get an idea about the game that we're talking about. So Guild Wars 2 was released about 11 years ago and has grown to be one of the most popular MMORPGs of our time. And regarding Wingman, we focus on its endgame player versus environment content, which mainly revolves around defeating challenging bosses with 5 to 10 players. I think in total we support around 60 different bosses of the game, and people group up and enter this instant content on a daily or weekly basis, and are motivated, of course, by some rewards that you can score, but also really by individual development. So improving themselves and their gameplay on their own, or the kill time together with their friends or long-time groups. So all of these bosses have different mechanics that have to be learned, played, and adapted to. Players have to take on certain roles, show movement patterns, come up with strategies on how to distribute their group, when to be where, learn how to react to mistakes that threaten the whole party to wipe, when to dodge, when to avoid boss attacks, and of course, how to deal the most damage possible in the different time zones of the combat. So damage is dealt by activating skills or casting spells, which can be done and finding rotations of skills, so optimal chains, combos, priorities, and loops of these, which to optimize is even harder than to learn the different boss encounters. So in the end, learning both boss patterns and your own class mechanics and how to adapt optimal behavior to an actual fight are the primary, I would say, long-term factors that players aim to learn in order to outperform their fellow players, achieve self-competence, and potentially compete in tournaments that are organized every now and then. So what do we have in the end? In the end, we have a very comparable environment for analytics, as most players are on a very similar equipment and attribute level. B, we have access to a large spectrum of player skill, from novices that just started raiding up to expert players or speedrunners and everything in between, which helps us, of course, studying game analytics for everyone's needs. And C, we can operate on many years of gameplay history already from a large pool of unique players, which is, of course, necessary when you want to produce valid and high quality analytics. And this kind of team-based PvE content is above that, I would say, quite generalizable for most, at least MMOs out there. And some of the analytics that we established are arguably also usable for competitive esports or PvP situations. And as I mentioned earlier, building a platform that suits the players' needs should be done with the community's demands and requirements in mind, which is why the development of Wingman followed a long-term participatory design development approach. So we straightforward build up a target group sample, assess their needs, implemented features, and reevaluated if this can answer the kind of questions they're looking for. To incorporate a bigger spectrum of player expertise, we started with recruiting people from raid training groups to implement what features would be important for novice players. And on the other hand, we contacted some highly skilled speedrun guilds to investigate what kind of insights they need on their end. So we asked them to spread the word and quickly attracted a lot of interested users. And to skip to the current day, after 2.5 years of participatory development, people uploaded more than 8 million unique combat logs, a display frame to frame atomic behavior, which makes up about 2.5 million hours of playing time. We have data from over 200,000 unique players that they voluntarily contributed, of course, and a couple thousand users, active users of the platform. So last year, I wrote up a Kai paper on what the community was most interested in, so I can wrap up these outcomes of the cycle and see what kinds, what themes of questions arose and what kind of data we are actually talking about right now. So first of all, there's of course the desire to replay combats the players already fought in detail and report all the decisions and behaviors of a single fight. So for this, we can luckily draw on Allied Insights, which is a partnering tool that produces these replays. Most of the players have used this feature before, so like 77%. And in the month where I looked into that, about 300, 500 users per day. So before I go into detail on what's contained there, just want to paint the bigger picture of the remaining needs and requirements of the community. So there are more than 60 bosses of the game that we support. And of course, a bigger question than single fights is, how can I approach a boss in general? Or how viable is my profession or any class of the game against a particular boss? So aggregating data from up to hundreds of thousands of combats per boss, we calculate distributions, medians, and progressions for every class and build of the game and display them in various charts. Viability can be then quantified by the damage per second, first of all, that they're able to deliver, the quality of buffs that they can support for the group, their contribution to the efficiency of playing the boss's phases and mechanics, and more. And every point in these box plots, for example, is linked to the replay report that you just have seen, so that interested users can directly investigate performances and compare them to their own. So this encounter analysis is feature is the one that's most used or it's used by most users per day, because there's no way you would get these viability insights in game or in any quantified way out of our platform. But this, of course, entails the next question: on which bosses can I improve my gameplay? As I said, a lot of players are interested in self-regulated learning, improving themselves, and comparing their performances to what other players of the same class have managed to produce, which of course excels as players ask for a leaderboard to climb the ladder of how well somebody plays his class, which has become one of the leading motivations to get insights from the platform in the first place. So a more general question would be, which professions, classes are used and have been used how often in relationship to others? Since we have data for the past 5 or 6 years now, we can display trends in game balancing by illustrating which classes are super popular right now and which are not played anymore. Apart from that, we also have a peer network of players, as they wanted to see how the players they play with are connected and which groups are forming from the data. And as this again is a team-based multiplayer environment, it's not obvious how to construct the best compositions of groups for any given boss, which does not necessarily follow from the performance of single classes in encounter analysis alone. So in that group composition features, users can assess what are the most frequent comps per boss, and on the other hand, what are the most efficient comps and why they are often different. Eventually, we also have a certain interest that focus on individual questions like, did I or my group improve in the last weeks? How does a skill rotation or action sequence unfold its damage over time? Or did my own damage improve over the last hours of training or grinding a boss or anything? For which we all added particular analytics features. You already see a certain color coding here, and this is what we have identified as greater themes after all these features came together. So people were interested in aggregate analytics that give general insights about the current state of the game and everything empirical around it. Individual analytics that focus on self-improvement and quantifying one's own performances, and desires to use our tool as a social platform to publish best performances and compare them to others, fight for ranks and whatever. Of course, there's a certain overlap, but these are the three general trends on why players use the platform. And yeah, I can still go on a little bit because I think I don't have that much time of the presentation covered. So having implemented all of these features, I also looked into how players actually make use of them in combination and how this can answer questions important to the community. So as you can see in this journey map, users most often start with encounter analysis or log analysis directly, but there are certain journey trends that protrude, and you don't have to pay attention that much because I will go into one example for that for popular trends, and which is what is the current state of the game balance, where people like to start on the popularity page. And at the time when we were writing the paper back then, there was a very clear trend that the mechanist class, for example, become more and more popular, up to a point where every third player played a mechanist, even though there are over 30 classes to choose from. So why is that? Players go and look why this is the case, which is, for example, the group composition page gives us a very clear image here. It is used in almost any comp during that time and even contributes more efficiency than any other profession. So it makes the boss kill faster. And yet the way faster skills, I'm not sure if you can see that, do not use a single mechanist. So let's investigate that further with the encounter analysis. At least for the first boss, mechanists seem to produce the highest median damage per second values over all the classes if you look at these box plots, which alone is of course a fair reason, but some of the Bladestorm players, as you could have seen, reached even higher damage numbers and therefore better efficiency. As all the pages are linked, we can just click on one of these dots, which I already did in the video, and immediately can replay the combat to see the strategy, follow the rotation, also the action sequences that these players executed in order to reach these overwhelming performances. And if you would have some in-game knowledge, players could already infer why getting high damage scores on a mechanist is way more likely than on a Bladesworn, because they have a drastically easier gameplay. So to make that a little bit clearer for today, we use another feature of our platform, which is rotation comparison, to compare the best possible action loop for a Bladesworn and that of a mechanist. And the mechanist comes off way less complex with less subloops and more forgiving. So long story short, as the general trend of player opinions shows that a more complex playstyle should probably also go along with higher rewards of damage potentials, the developers actually followed that player demands and nerfed the class accordingly, while our platform delivered empirical quantifications accessible to inform everyone. This was just one example of how players make use of the platform's data and features, which is also reflected in their qualitative remarks, but that's in that last year's paper if you're interested in more. And of course, it does not stop there. Players are using it for plenty of application cases. And after this paper, we already looked into multiple other ways of interpreting and analyzing the data. So after that first Kai paper that presented the community-driven approach to construct a game analytics platform for players' needs, we submitted a journal paper where we investigated about 700 players and assessed what particular dimensions of balancing are important for them and how to quantify them in a data-driven fashion. So for this, we mainly relied on performance distributions of different classes here, assessed by damage per second. Keep that in mind. So damage per second values of the players scoring on each particular boss during one specific patch version. And we looked into how we can systematically find imbalances that deviate from what players want. So this directly fed into a Kai Play paper from a few weeks ago, where we went over to how to integrate these former balancing criteria that we got from the community into a tool that auto balances classes after player opinions. And on another note, on this year's conference on games, we showed how to extract spatial strategies, map them onto higher level zone transitions, and derived systematic difference between better and worse teams. Also, of course, between their damage and kill times. And finally, to not only rely on aggregate statistics, we also looked into visualizing low-level behavior differences between skilled and non-skilled behavior, and how to find out and visualize pathways or sequences that lead to suboptimal performances in the other two publications here. So some of the main or co-authors might also be here today. I already saw Jimmy. So if you're particularly interested in any of these works, they can chime in the discussion later. But why am I talking about that? It's not just for advertisement, because in all of that work that we have done, individual performance is the key to visualize something, or to assess balance criteria in the second, third, or to make a separation between good and bad players in all of the lower papers. And why this assessment of individual performance is difficult. Why that is, I will come to in a minute. So just to wrap up what we did with that data, our latest project actually involves building an entire quite accurate simulator of the game and using that as a backend to optimize rotations, action sequences. And using that tool, players can search for the best existing rotations the players uploaded to our platform already, or click together and explore own custom rotations without the need of perfectly executing them in-game, or even you can even apply some traditional AI techniques to predict the next best steps. So this already led to the precise prediction of future balance patch impacts and was used to reveal damage strategies that even outperformed the best players of some classes already. But it operates also just on one measure of performance or proficiency, which is damage per second. Again, I won't bore you with too many features or visualizations anymore, but I just wanted to give at least an impression on what kind of data we're talking about. And if that's not clear enough, I can go step by step into what we have and what that might mean afterwards. And as we are in the Open Game Data Initiative here, I'm also very open to share that database, minus some private logs from closed groups for the sake of game data science. So right now I have a very ugly and badly documented API that works just for routine queries. But if you're interested in using such data for more interesting purposes, please reach out to me and we can explore together what might be needed or what would have been added to the API. So if there are no further questions, of course, there's probably a lot of question marks, I would connect that to the to one of the more recent research questions we're working with, which is skill acquisition, or if you will, learning, of course. So I suspect that there are many factors important for learning games, and some of them might be captured by such a data-driven perspective, by all the data that we have, and I hope we can benefit in multiple ways from that. So for a start, mastering complex video games is associated with, or at least requires, perceptual skills, response selection, motor skills, attentional skills, cognitive skills, and teamwork or social skills. So analyzing factors how to learn these games could give insights on how to improve such skills even beyond games, right? And learning how to learn could save, for example, aspiring esports athletes so much time, because the number one thing players are doing to get better is what? It's grinding. It's spending spending more and more time playing game after game in the hope to become better, which can not only have mental and physical health risk, of course, but recent work has also shown that this is not even effective. You stop learning at some time. So finding other factors that support learning complex games can become quite important. But before looking into factors that could influence a player's performance, we first have to answer that basic question, which is, did I improve at all? Well, which is, yes, of course, we want to answer this, but this is already way too complicated. So we have to start with, how did I do? And this is already complicated enough. So for today, I was asked to prepare a hard question of my current research about games data. And when I thought about it for a minute, the most discussions of the player community, because I'm still doing that participatory development approach, revolve around the most simple, basic question of all. How can we accurately quantify the performance of an individual player? Because in order to improve yourself, you need accurate feedback. And in order to judge if one player should be higher on the leaderboard than another, for example, you need an accurate estimation of that performance. And in the base game, you would have no information at all. So players only know that the boss died or not, and can only give an educated guess how good it was that they did and how they did it, or they take and record the kill time or something like that. But this is so crude. Of course, we have both of these in the data. So we could, for example, take the win rate or success rate of defeating a boss as a predictor for performance. Clearly, you would say that a player that has a higher success rate on a boss is a better player than one with a lower success rate, right? Or that you had 40% a month ago and now you have 70%, you should have gotten better. But while this might hold for players with comparable habits, in reality, it's actually quite the contrary. So players who are interested in improving themselves systematically and play together in a group, they would fail or reset a boss over and over again to find better strategies on how to approach this boss, or how to polish their execution. So success rates of the best players can look like this, which makes this metric completely unusable for us. Well, okay, but now we can say that these better groups these better groups are doing that in order to produce way faster kill times, right? So only look at the kill times, and a group that is able to defeat a boss faster is definitely better than a group that it kills it slower, right? So while this might be true most of the time, it only implicitly entails an individual player's performance information. So you could have done well, or you could have been way worse than usual. If the other 9 players in your team are performing really good or bad, the performance of a single one really does not make a difference anymore. So that might work in single player modes, but this is not really usable to get an accurate estimation of how well you fared in multiplayer situations. So what else do we got in the data? And I spoiled this a couple of times already. Of course, we have damage per second distributions. So if you remember, combat mainly happens through the executions of skills. Skills do damage to the boss. So the faster and better I choose my skills, the better the combos, priorities, and rotations, the more damage I will have dealt over time in the end. This might be an arbitrary number, that damage number, and it's highly boss specific, but I can still compare that to other players of the same class, as in this distribution here, and see it in relation. So these 3 orange dots, not sure if you can see them, on the plot, for example, would be my final DPS numbers on that boss versus those of 100 other random players in the same player class. So let's say that that is my variable to measure, and I look at all the DPS values recorded at the same encounter over dozens and hundreds of tries, and ta-da, there we have it. Nice, looks like a textbook learning curve, more or less, and this is what we want, right? Well, yes and no. Because, and of course there has to be a caveat, this example here is a DPS progression, or is progression data from the training area, so not from boss fights. So in that training area, at least I think it was 2, players can practice their rotations alone, without any interference, under optimal circumstances, without any boss mechanics, and so on. So it's at least nice that we can see some learning curve here with the naked eye already. And if you would do a linear regression, which I apologize because learning is of course not happening linearly, was just the quickest thing to do now, we would end up with an R square of 0.77 or something, which is a fairly large effect. But what is about the actual boss performance? So the stuff that is way more interesting, right? The stuff that you train for. On the same player, and okay, I admit it's my own data for that sake, on one particular boss with the same class, on 46 boss kills across 2 years of playing, you would get this kind of graph. And is there a learning effect? Maybe, but that really is a rocky ride. And this is one of the good examples I can tell you. Because if I look at some other players or other bosses, it can become really different. So either there's no incline in any way, or it can heavily bounce, as you can see. Or if you have a look at the green one at the bottom, it shows so many things at the same time. So this is taken from one of the best players of that particular class. It's not me. On a 4-year history of fighting the same boss 650 times. So we see upwards and downwards trends and some big outliers, but we would not say that this guy did not improve at all. Even though the linear regression is nearly zero, right? Or that he systematically got worse at some point. But if we only take the final DPS, so damage per second scores, as granted, we could not differentiate that. But why is that? So DPS is influenced by basically everything. So if your group fails to support you, for example, if they don't properly fulfill their role as a supporter or healer, you will likely do less damage, even if your own execution is flawless. Worst case, you die or get into a down state, so you're not able to do any damage anymore. Of course, sometimes it's your own fault, but sometimes not. And even more, if other players need help and you decide to help them by, for example, resurrecting them, you would likewise lose time that you could have spent doing damage. So does it make you a better player to ignore your group mates and just greed for damage? Probably not. Same holds for playing like boss mechanics. So after all, fighting the boss in that game is not a simple button mashing, but often players have to take on certain roles in order to weaken the boss or to save the party or to enable progress or anything. So in most cases, this goes along with not being able to completely focus on dealing damage anymore. But players that are voluntarily taking on these roles and maybe mastering the execution of these mechanics, are these worse than players who choose the easy path and just only deal DPS? Probably not, right? But going after raw final DPS scores lets them appear that way. And of course, there's even more. Like online games undergo constant balance patches, so it might be that your class gets more or less powerful, which is of course reflected in the DPS, but that does not necessarily mean that the player improved or degraded. And to a bit more technical again, it's also heavily influenced by the phase window. So the time that you're actually able to deal damage, which of course is different in different groups, because the boss would die or phase sooner or later, depending on the quality of your group. Let me nerd into that again. So apologies if I go into too much detail, because I know that some of you are probably not familiar with the genre, but I just want to paint the picture why this is hard and what is important to think about when quantifying individual performance and what we can measure. So these are two DPS graphs over time during one combat. It's just over seconds. It's from two classes under optimal circumstances. So that orange class would be a bit more bursty or front heavy, front loaded, right? So DPS falls down after an initial onset. After maybe 20 seconds, it's not as good anymore as the green one. So it benefits from short phases or short boss fights.
I think we lost a mic. Can't hear you.
Hello. Yeah, is
Yep,
that
there we
better?
go.
Awesome. Okay. It randomly decided to just turn itself off. If it's the battery, I will just switch to something else. Sorry for that. To make it even more confusing. So what I wanted to say is the orange class is a bit front loaded, and the green class slowly ramps up its DPS and benefits from long phases. And this is something that you see all the time. So that also means that in groups where people kill the boss faster, the orange class players will always score higher than if the kill would be slower, because they are in a range to be preferred, right? Which is still borderline acceptable, because you would think that optimizing your group time or the kill time should also positively influence your performance. But that also means that for players of the green class, it's better if the rest of your group is really bad, because that extends the time you would fight the boss and your damage can nicely ramp up until the top. Since I'm also calculating leaderboards based on naive DPS right now, people approached me actually several times saying, hey, look at this log. That player is kind of cheating. He just pays everyone else to do basically nothing at all until he or she reaches insane damage values. And even if it does not look super drastic on this chart here, it easily becomes apparent what's the outcome if you bring it to that extreme. Even if you could make do with outlier removal for this specific case, for example, your data would still contain a bias that says players in worse groups will get higher scores, independent if they're doing well or not, which I hope you can agree on is not how a score for individual performance should look like. But what else? I mean, one thing that I had in mind was not to value the outcome, so the DPS, but if players made the right choice at the right time, or if they executed the most optimal action at every time step. So if we know that optimal rotation, we could do a similarity mapping from the rotation of player X at some time, like dynamic time warping or anything. But first of all, we don't necessarily know the optimal rotation. And second, it still has a couple of the same limitations that raw DPS also has. So screw that. Sorry for even mentioning that. Going back here, because this is the best thing that we have so far, even with all its limitations. But maybe we could find out all of these and somehow accredit them or something. So for the problem of shorter time windows that I just mentioned, instead of comparing the final DPS number to the best number that another player could have done, I could really focus on every single step in time and see how much that deviates from the currently best known performance of that time window. So in the ideal case, there would be zero difference in every second, because you would be the best at every second or something. And here, like if you look at the orange performance, that would result in a couple thousand DPS difference every second. So the orange one would definitely be judged as worse as the red one, right? Which we could I could do if I'm counting every single second. But just for reference, if only taking the raw final DPS value, the orange player would have scored around 50,000 DPS, I would say, if you can see that, whereas the red player, playing a way longer phase, ended up somewhere at 37,000 or something. But we would all agree that the red performance is actually a better performance at all times that he or she spent, right? And the same is with the slowly growing DPS curves. So we should agree that the purple player here is playing better than the blue one at every time step, even though the final DPS would only result in like 39,000 DPS as compared to the steadily increasing blue one, which goes up to over 40, 41 something. So let's throw some pseudo math on that for every time step from 0 to the end of the player's performance. If you have that in mind, I could compute the DPS value at that time step divided by the maximum measured DPS at that time step from that class at that boss. If it's greater than that, of course, there would be the new maximum. So that fraction would always range between 0 and 1, with 0 being the worst and 1 being the best score. And after that, everything is summed up and divided by the number of timestamps, which makes the whole metric range between 0 and 1, right? So that is something that I came up with basically yesterday. And I also have a system for when a new balance patch starts and ends. So I would only compare that to performances within the same patch era to keep it comparable. So then that game changes don't have an influence on that. And let's assume that works. We can talk in a minute about that. But it still neglects if I do anything else than damage. For example, helping players or playing mechanics. So I could ask, how much do people lose? So maybe. So if I want to make use of that huge data set, I could say, how much does a player of that class lose on average if they decide to help resurrect another player or play a mechanic? Or even how much do you lose every time you resurrect someone? So if I do a quick query, looking at one boss, players of one class, only doing one current balance patch, it would get me this, which is not as nice, as clean as expected, but at least a downwards trend. And if you're not looking at one class, but at all, like we have a similar like a picture painted with the rocky bumps probably stemming from sparse data and high variation in those higher numbers of resurrection, because usually you don't have to resurrect 20 times. So your body would do something really wrong. And we can, of course, also do that for the boss mechanics, since we logged them as well, which also shows us if a player does not only do damage, but plays that mechanic once, that usually uses him 1000 DPS and twice about 2000 DPS and so on. So if you're doing something else, we could maybe compensate for that. So basically, that would probably also be expressed in relation. So not I lost 2000 DPS, but I lost 5% of my potential DPS or something like that. Which we could all collect, right? And going all over the boss mechanics, we could compute how much we would lose. How much we would lose, could average them up again, and would end up in a DPS loss factor, hypothetically, or something like that. So in that little example that I just put here without any further thought, it would be like 5% losing by resurrecting, 13% losing by playing that mechanic X, and 3% by mechanic Y, which would average to that. And now that I think about it, they should probably be factored and not averaged. But anyway, it's just a crude idea until now. And of course, the same could be done for group support and deaths and etc. I could just see how much you lose if you don't have that versus you have. But I think that would send out a wrong signal. Probably, basically, you don't have to pay attention and can die and still get a good performance, or your group does not have to take care for your buff up time and stuff. So it would be probably rather wise to incentivize positive behavior in that regard. But that's another story. Yeah, let's just pretend that works for a second. So I could just take the green part, our like cleaned DPS performance score, and compensate some non-greedy behavior like assisting other players or taking care of mechanics by getting that score back through the yellow part. Sadly, that doesn't range between 0 and 1 anymore. And I'm sure there's a lot of problematic things going on with that already. And I admit that I only had some of these ideas for these calculations while preparing this presentation in the last 1 or 2 days. But the greater topic of how do we quantify individual performance is hopefully clear, and maybe you have a series of other ideas that could move into that assessment. And yeah, of course, that the outcome of that formula is somewhat arbitrary. And right now, players have DPS numbers, and they kind of know what they mean, even with all of their limitations. So it would kind of have to be transformed into something like ABCDS, double S, whatever ranking that some JRPGs are doing, or stars in Western games. But yeah, apologies again for a lot of jargon and nerdy nitty-gritty details, but I hope you could get the concept why it's not super easy, and maybe you have a good idea what I could look at or change when doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thanks. We are all for jargon and nitty-gritty detail. That's the point of this.
Awesome.
A lot of particularly new jargon from this one. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, it's a really interesting problem of thinking about performance when you're collective, but also individual. and
That's right.
um, and I was kind of thinking about this from a standpoint of like what we call difficulty factors assessment
Mm-hmm.
in educational technology, which is kind of what you're getting at here of like introduce factors here, and then it just becomes this really complicated. It becomes a more complicated than linear regression model,
Yeah.
where each one of these things would adopt a a coefficient on the
Mm.
model given data. And I guess one of the questions would be, it's like, do you have enough data, or are you going to like blow away all your degrees of freedom if you like add a billion new factors? um, and like, are you going to be dealing with that low end tail all the time? That's going to be probably just like adding a bunch of points versus
Yes.
like maybe you shelve it or something where like if they're getting down to like 20 plus resurrections, it just becomes 20 plus rather than literally the number
Oh
20.
yeah. You could just cap it. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Because it's
yeah, or something. I don't know. Um, but yeah, that would be interesting to explore. The other thing I was thinking about is in the kind of skill modeling that we do in intelligent tutoring systems, such as
mm-hmm.
data mining and stuff, is like what are the skills involved? And it almost like right now you're kind of making the assumption that dealing damage is the core skill for everybody, but like
It's a
if
big
it,
yeah. It's just the best that
yeah,
we can measure, but that's
right.
not everything. Yeah, go ahead.
But if I'm like a character, like I assume the characters kind of fall into rough categories of type of
I know what
character.
you're going. Yeah, of
Maybe not
course.
as hard as like in a MOBA, but like if I am a buffing character, could you, instead of doing maximum potential damage, could you do
Yeah.
maximum potential buff level for all my
Yeah, of
teammates?
course. I mean that's of course also in the data, and we could definitely also incorporate that. So probably in the end, it boils all to down to what is your role, what should you do, and how much of that did you do, right? Maybe for supporters it's not even that hard, because for if you have some buffs, yeah, like buffers, right? If they do their job best, then like probably the group would have like a 100% uptime of the needed buffs or something like that, if that's
Mm-hmm.
a if it's a game where you can do that. So there's an actual defined limit, right? And for a healer, it's maybe the same, because you definitely want to take care of your party so that no one dies. Um, for DPS, I guess there is no limit, right? Or that limit is dynamic, because you don't know how much you can actually deal. So there's no 100%. It's all relative, I guess. It's different
Mm-hmm.
things.
Could you do, instead of potentially DPS, could you do like percentage of boss health over time or something like that? Because that would bound it to, because like presumably you can't do boss health's worth of DPS, right? Because then he would kill the boss. So like there is kind of a limit. I guess maybe
Yeah.
they can heal. I don't know too many. I'm not super familiar with Guild Wars 2's bosses,
No,
right?
no, no, don't worry, don't worry. Yeah, just we can start thinking very crude. I mean, it's very comparable to other RPGs, or like multiplayer RPGs when it comes to that. There's
Mm-hmm.
there's health bars, and it's better when your health bar is up and the boss is down. So let's talk that.
Thought I might mention just on that topic of, yeah, like DPS versus buffs, and forgive me if this was mentioned and I missed it, but you can also imagine sort of depending on exactly how much detail you get in your data, thinking about like crediting. Like you talked about how the as buffs are added, the DPS goes up for the particular player who's being buffed. I can
Hmm.
imagine doing the math to sort of credit that additional data to the person who provided a buff.
Oh yeah.
So to do sort of a weighting of scores and basically say, well, okay, so as the character who received a buff, when we're calculating these DPSs, maybe we're not, crediting you with that extra DPS if it came from a buff, and instead we're going to credit that to the person who.
Yeah, I really like that. And I know where you're going, because that is, of course, the added value that you bring to the table, right? As a buffer. Like if you would not have me, if you would not have that buff, you would do 20% less damage or something like that. And I guess it's easy to calculate for buffs that say, okay, this character does 20% more damage, right? So that's something that you can actually derive. Where it's not as easy to say for buffs that say, okay, now I allow your character to attack 33% faster, for example, because it's not really 30% 33% more damage, but sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less, because you also work with cooldowns and that kind of stuff, right? So even though you can click your buttons faster, it does not mean that you can bring everything into that. And on the other hand, sometimes it's even more, because you have some self buffs or something, or some short time windows where you do more damage. And of course, if you can attack faster in that time window, it's even extrapolated, and it becomes even more complicated with buffs that decrease your cooldowns, because you don't really know, okay, does that player would that player execute that skill earlier if he would have that cooldown reduction or not. It's quite complicated to derive it mathematically correct, but I guess you could definitely do also have that, like if you have a lot of data, you could definitely say how much are players of that class, so to be comparable, doing if they have their buff. And now I'm getting the same or like I'm getting also a query where players don't have that buff, or like only have 50% uptime of that buff. Where's the difference statistically, right? So you could at least estimate empirically what is the impact of having then that buff versus not. And I guess that could be that could be attributed to the supporter, to the buffer in that case.
Could you potentially, this might get difficult, but given that you had a simulator thing, could you like simulate the counterfactual? Like
yes.
and so like maybe it's like, maybe could you do like team damage per second, and then essentially attribute fractions of it, like do a blame assignment of fractional team DPS. You could look at like, you could even start to potentially attribute that to like healers or something if they resurrected a player, because like every damage post resurrection is partially due to the fact that the healer is there to resurrect them. Like,
yeah. So then there's the fact, what do you want to do that counterfactual reasoning for every action that somebody has done?
Yeah, it starts to get kind of messy, but it would be kind of fun. Like,
it would be
I
really
could see it being a fun like case study on like maybe a couple hundred matches just to see if it's even feasible before trying to run it on a massive database and
of course, yeah. I mean, hypothetically, that would be really, really cool. I think the branching factor is super high, of course.
Yeah.
And the thing is that even though the simulator runs in maybe in 100 to 500 milliseconds or something, if there is 20,000 logs uploaded every day, I would not be able to to follow that or something like that, or to keep up. But for a selection, that would be. Let me actually write that down. I like that. Yeah.
The other thing I thought might be worth bringing up is like at a higher level, thinking about like if we're framing this as skill acquisition and thinking in more detail about what we mean by skill. I think Erik made some reference to like what are the skills to be acquired.
Yes.
And also that that aspect of like the team aspect really obviously comes up a lot every time we start to talk about something here. And it seems like there's sort of this ground up approach that's been taken where we're trying to look at individual skills, the lowest level things, and just find ways to work around those team effects. And I'd be interested in, what this analysis might look like if we think of it from more of a top down of assessing collective like team skill or thinking of teamwork as a skill to be acquired and sort of attacking from that angle and potentially that gives you something to contrast against when you try to dig deeper into individual performance. If we've already got sort of a good sense or a good model for what the team performance is collectively, rather than trying to say, let's look at an individual and just come up with clever ways to like factor out the team. Yeah, potentially sort of taking a reverse look at it.
Yeah. I'm actually curious, could you do this potentially for the, like you had those transition diagrams of skill acquisition.
Yeah.
Could you do those at the collective level?
Could I do
Or
this?
or
I
is
mean
the
that
branching factor there also extreme?
I think that depends on the level of abstraction, right? So I borrowed a little bit from Jimmy's work, who's also today here, in order to produce these nice kind of visualizations. And I know that he's also working on abstracting stuff. But then, like, if you want to do abstraction in an automatic way, you definitely have to classify some kind of, okay, what is that strategy that's going on right now, right? Because if you have I don't know, 3 to 4 actions per second per player for 10 players, that makes a lot of things happening at the same time, which can be messy, of course. We had another paper where we predicted that and classified that based on the movement that players are doing, because most of these boss fights are happening on a map, right? And you can, like, if you have a top-down view, it is often the case that the spatial location is correlated to what players are doing right now, right? For example, fleeing from that boss or approaching the boss, or doing some kind of mechanics at this position or that one. So that is something, but not. I mean, that's also quite shallow, I would say. So it does not. That's maybe too abstract because it only gives you a very. So where's the sweet spot in between, right? Yeah. Really, sorry, I really like your idea, Luke. I just didn't have a good answer to that yet. So I'll have a thought.
I also found it interesting because you kind of introduced those transition diagrams, and then you're like, and then we're gonna just dismiss those as being able to like, because you know these optimal sequences, and it's kind of like, how did you do the optimal sequence or not? And actually, I wonder if that could be kind of interesting to look at for essentially this, that you could take that, essentially that entire sequence could be a skill. And there's just a bunch of different possible skills to be executing, and you could be like, how am I doing on this one versus this one versus this one versus this one? And like, you could model them all, you could intentionally model them all individually as a diverse collection. And then players who might want to be like self-improving, for example, they might be like, well, I want to learn this strat specifically.
Yeah.
How well am I learning that strat rather than how well am I learning this collective thing?
Of course. The thing is that we kind of know optimal rotations or the optimal pathways, right? Sequences of skills from brute forcing and theory crafting and seeing what's working, because no developer gives that information, right? Most, to be honest, they don't know it anyway. So they just put it out and see, oh, that was too much. People are doing performing way too good. We have to nerf this again. So you don't really know that before you don't have tried it. And the thing is that it's really variable, because like on every of the bosses, you cannot just play the same kind of skill sequence. Maybe 95% of the time, but you always have to adapt it to the phases, to things that you have to in addition, when you would have to dodge, or maybe you have to go away from the boss, and you always have to build that into your rotation. That is the actual hard thing to do, because if you just memorizing one sequence of actions is it's not easy, and it's still, you have to be quick on the keyboard, but it's still comparatively easy to adapting a play style to real scenario. So it's hard to say, okay, yeah, we know what the best thing is, and can compare, or like it can say, yeah, you adhered to that optimal thing, because we don't really know the best thing. The only the only thing that we can do again is, of course, go the data-driven thing again, and say, okay, given the maybe 10,000 logs I have so far in the last time from that boss, from that class, from other players that played the same thing, we could compare it to the best one that numerically reached, again, right, the highest damage in that phase. What did he or she did right, and how far does it deviate from that, or something? That is what you can do, but yeah, it's still not 100% clean. Because basically you would need to have god gamers. You would always have to need to have people that perform optimally in order to say, okay, this is how you should behave. And every other month, like every 2 or 3 months, when there's a new balance patch, you shouldn't probably compare the same stuff anymore, because it changes a little bit. So there's maybe a new good rotation. So you start from scratch, and then you cannot give any suggestion if you would go for such a comparative thing again. Yeah, it's a lot of tiny variables that make that difficult. And for now, I fared quite well with just doing that, just taking DPS and don't touch it for too much. But then again, you have players who are saying, okay, it is quite easy if you know the target variable that leads to the to the skill assessment, or the proficiency, or whatever, the performance assessment. If you know that function, how it's calculated, you can probably influence it in game to your like in your odds, right? Which is, for example, for the class that slowly builds up the damage, there were actually people who were telling others, okay, please stop what you're doing. I want to be in the focus of attention here. I want to produce artificially high numbers, and they spoil, of course, the fun for anybody who's competing fairly, I would say. So this is why I was thinking maybe there's a better way to do this, and what could we do?
That comes to mind that I thought I would throw out there that's a little bit more concrete, and maybe this is something that comes through in a different way. Thinking about sports analytics, I happen to be a fan of American football,
Oh
and
yeah,
there's
which team?
this statistic sort of come out of their like
sorry.
the football like metrics community that is called expected points added, EPA, and it's like basically an efficiency metric that can help to get at sort of the value of an individual move, where essentially they take a lot of like sort of game state values, like in that case, it's things like what's the current score, what's the position of the team on the field,
Yep.
how much time is remaining in the game, and come up with an expected value given that particular state, an expected value for the final total score of the team.
Okay.
And then after an individual play, like you can look at the difference because the game advances in sort of discrete plays. You can look before and after the play, what was the state, and find the difference in expected points. And so I don't know if there's a way that that's necessarily, you know, as a statistical concept, has come across in other ways that metrics are done in video games, but that could potentially be a thing to draw on and maybe come up with sort of an equivalent where here your state variables might be health remaining collectively for your team, current like point estimate of team DPS, health remaining in the boss, things like that. And potentially, given that you do have a significant number of logs to draw on from various bosses, you might be able to come up with sort of an equivalent way of estimating some kind of expectation of whether that's, you know, total damage that will be done, which hopefully is, you know, equal to what the boss has available to it, or some kind of outcome metric. All of that to say, that's sort of one statistical approach that's had some success in another sort of team-based game where you're trying to tease out individual contributions.
Yeah.
And that might be a way that you could then quantify, like, when I made this attack or made this buff, here was how it changed the expected outcome for my team.
Oh, okay. And in NFL, they map that to the actual move that they made, or what's that, like to the strategy action that they
so
pursued?
I'm a little bit fuzzy. I know that the people who calculate these, they've got some methods for estimating an individual player's contribution to like the team EPA. Like my understanding of the numbers of it is like conceptually, statistically, that mostly just lives at my understanding of the sort of team level EPA for like the whole team was involved in this one play, right? There are approaches, in the NFL to estimating at an individual level based on what the team did. You can sort of say, well, these were the people who were involved primarily. You know, this was the player who carried the ball, so therefore we can attribute. I think in this context, you know, if we treat an individual attack or an individual buff as like the play, then you sort of right there you have this player is the one who took this attack, and so then we're able to sort of directly attribute the change in expectation to that player's action.
Yeah, I can. I'll definitely have a deeper look into that. I just noted that down. They are. I would guess they're following that metric because of live comment. How's it called? Live commentatory or something like that, right? And they want to see what's the likeliest next step, right? While usually, what I've done, or like what players in my platform are doing, is just, how's it called, retrospective, looking at things again, or submitting something in order to get feedback for that. But I guess still we can still get some kind of information about how much did you contribute to the success to the outcome, right? Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool. I should have worn my NFL cap today.
I wonder if one of the challenges in trying to map from like the NFL, their like sports type of analytics is like, while there are like 30-some people on the field, there's really only one like core focus of action most of the time. It's a little, I think it's probably easier to do some of the attribution because it's like, what did you do in relation to the ball? Whereas in a game like this, you probably could for some bosses say, what did you do in relation to
the boss?
I'm sure there are ads in some of these fights and all these other things
course.
that probably cause additional challenges.
Yeah, I mean, challenges. There are enough challenges, but it's good to see how we can like slowly move into something that is, even if it's just a little more accurate than just taking the bare raw minimum what we're doing right now. Cool. Yeah, we'll look into these.
Yeah, I think the percentage contribution to team DPS would be really interesting.
Yeah, of course.
Recognizing that some of those things are going to be difficult to statistically estimate, but
and that's super easy, right? Of course, that's super easy to measure. But then, as you again, as you already said, the contribution to the group DPS of a healer, for example, might be not as high, or like maybe non-existent at all. But they might have carried the whole thing, right? So maybe they were responsible for the whole success of everything, because everyone else was just slacking off, and he really outperformed, or like he did more than they should. But you never know, because you can't measure it, and it's only easy to measure DPS. And even if you go for like heal per second or something like that, that's not even a good metric, because it does not show you how good of a healer you are, but it shows more how bad of a group you are, because they run into all of the attacks and lose so much health or something, and you have to compete with that. So and it's also super easy to cheat, or to cheese, right? Because you can easily become the best healer in the world if you just tell your friends, okay, you have to tank so much damage now, and I will heal you. So that's also not something that's, yeah. But it comes again. I think what you said before from the domain of ITS is better. Okay, what is the goal, or what's the skill required or involved? What's the goal? What's the desired role that has to be covered? And if everything is alive, then the healer probably did his job well. So you can quantify. Yeah, so we could quantify that into that. And that's actually a very, very good thing, because right now the leaderboards that we have so far, and it's running a fairly long time, and I was just too lazy to change that, because no matter what you change, some people will always complain because it's not in their favor. But right now, of course, it does not acknowledge any contribution of a healer to the fight, because it just looks at the DPS, which is bad. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Well, we are a little bit over time, I think, but thanks a lot for sharing your work, and looking forward to seeing what new things.
Is it? Oh, was it just 60 minutes? I somehow had 2 hours in mind.
The Kai Play session.
That was the Kai Play. Okay,
and then
yeah.
I think the usual idea is going for an hour and a half ish.
Okay, yeah, no, that sounds good. That sounds good.
And we'll see how well we stick to that.
Well, if we have a calendar invite, then these things will become very clear then in the end. Yeah, thanks for all the feedback. I have a couple points that are worth delving into and looking up. Not that I'm not busy enough, but that's really really nice. And yeah, it was a cool thing to have the opportunity to just speak here. What's here in the chat? Yeah, okay, that's just something like that. I can, of course, drop you some links or something in the Slack for those of you who are in Slack, because Zoom will disappear anyway. And of course, I think in data science, or in game data science especially, it's really hard to get data. So if you're in any way interested in having a lot of data, even though it's not your favorite game, we can definitely work something out. And that's more on the non-scientific, non-serious game side, if you're interested in that, of course. Cool, thanks. And have a great day or evening for wherever you
morning,
are, and have fun at the whist.
Yeah, there's been some interesting stuff so far.
Awesome.
For anybody who, if you somehow made it to this Zoom and are not already on the Slack, please please feel free to reach out and join. If you have your own project that you potentially want to talk about, we are totally open to adding more to the schedule going forward. And looking forward to continuing to advance sharing out about different game data approaches.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Johannes.
Thanks,
everyone.
Right. See you around.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. All right. And we will put a recording up unless you don't want us to.
No, don't worry.
as soon
I
as we
think
talk.
it just has to have that disclaimer that I can repeat that, of course, that this presentation included material subject to ArenaNet, Inkel was to trademark, NCSoft, and whatever. That's also on the first slide.
Yeah,
Don't fool around.
I think we got that.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
See you later.
See you.